A nice crowd gathering today. I want to welcome you to the presidential address. I'm Matt Stagner. I am the immediate past president of APPAM, and it is my distinct pleasure and about the best role that the immediate past president has to introduce the president as he or she gives her presidential address. So when the address concludes, there'll be time for comments and questions. And if you have any questions, you should submit them through the Q&A widget at the bottom function of your screen. So you should see a Q&A there. Enter them at any point, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. So let me first introduce the giver of the presidential address, Marie Cancian. For those of you who don't know Maria, who is someone I'm thinking many of you know, she is currently the Dean of the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. Before she joined Georgetown, she spent many years at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where many of us got to know her, but she's also had many other roles. She served as a senior advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services. She served as a Casey Family Program Senior Fellow, as a W.T. Grant Foundation Distinguished Fellow in Residence, a visiting scholar at Russell Sage, and a visiting fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. She received her doctorate in economics from the University of Michigan. And today she'll be talking about family matters, reflections on who counts and why. I am truly excited to hear what Maria has to say to us. And I thought those of you who don't know, I could go on with 1,000 words, or I could show a picture or two that helps you understand Maria and where she comes from. So I was looking for a picture of Maria in action, and this was the only one I could come up with. This is from a site visit that Maria, Lisa Klein-Vogel, and I did for a child support project in Wisconsin, and we made a side trip to Lambeau Field. As a Bears fan, it was not an easy thing for me to do. And I thought, what would Vince Lombardi say that would be reflective of Maria and her viewpoints? And it was not easy going through his quotes to actually find one that fit Maria particularly well, but I found this one, which is individual commitment to a group effort. That is what makes a team work, a company work, a society work, a civilization work. And to me, that summarizes Maria's career. She has been committed to many group efforts at Wisconsin, at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, at Georgetown, and perhaps most importantly at APPAM, where her individual commitment and commitment to the team has really made society work better. I also found this, which, well, on that trip, I had told Maria about a T-shirt at the University of Chicago, which says, "That's all well and good in practice, but how does it work in theory?" And she said, "I have to have one of those shirts." And of course, the reason she wanted it is because she believes just the opposite. She is totally committed to the craft of public policy analysis and to making sure that what works in theory is also working in practice and working at the ground level. She represents all parts of APPAM, public policy analysis and management. She's worked at all levels of public policy, local, state, and federal. She also, to me, personifies a word that she probably hates to hear, which is interoperability. She is someone who has tried to make sense of the crazy quilt of public programs for her entire life and done a great job at helping us understand how that quilt fits together and also where the patches are wearing thin or where they're missed. So she has a deep commitment to racial and social justice and a constant consideration of who the work of APAM and her own folks in public policy is really for, and that is the people of the world, and particularly those who most need it. So it is with great pleasure that I will stop sharing the screen and get on to hearing what Maria has to say to us today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you for that very kind introduction. And thanks to all those who are joining here, as Matt and I were saying before, even without the traditional presidential reception and refreshments. Before I begin my remarks, I want to also thank the many friends and colleagues at APPAM who have taught me so much over the years. And I think the slides are going to advance, I hope. I'm not controlling them. I want to thank the many friends and colleagues at APPAM who have taught me so much over the years. I owe too many debts to enumerate, but I will note, if you can read this slide, that Dan Meyer's name appears 3 times on this page of acknowledgements. I owe him special thanks for a career-long collaboration, though he does not necessarily agree with everything I'm going to say today. So what do I want to talk about today? Data matters. We've heard that in previous presidential addresses. Evidence matters. Policy arguments that ignore evidence, that cherry pick or misrepresent results are easy targets. But I want to argue today that less uniformly articulated in policy analytic circles, at least, is that one's perspective matters. This is more troubling, especially for well-informed policy analysts who participate in APPAM activities. I will argue that even when we bring our best research methods to the analysis of the best data available, our personal history and perspective influences the questions we ask or the assumptions that inform the data we collected in ways that can compromise our ability to provide robust policy analysis. Moreover, I will argue that when this history and perspective reflects inequitable structures, our analysis may compound inequities and limit positive change. I'm going to focus my critique on my area of research and my specialty, family policy, and especially child support policy. I want to review key changes in family organization and the evolution of child support policy in the context of those changes. And then I'm going to argue that initial child support enforcement efforts were often framed in terms of fathers being unwilling rather than unable to pay substantial support, a perspective primarily consistent with the experience of middle-class white families, even while policies took a punitive approach that was consistent with racialized policies targeting poor Black families. More recent policy initiatives, which I think better account for some fathers' limited work and earnings, have failed to recognize that mothers too face challenges in the labor market, as they also typically manage greater care responsibilities for children. As with most APPAM things, I will conclude with a discussion of implications for policy and for policy analysis. So over the last half century, our understanding of families has been transformed, and I think 2 changes are particularly salient for child support policy: the substantial increase in children living apart from one of their parents, and the continued importance of fathers' economic contributions, despite men's reduced advantages in work and earnings relative to women. Today, about 40% of children are born to unmarried parents. Those children often live with both cohabiting parents initially, but those cohabiting unions are often short-lived. By the early 2000s, in addition, about 1/3 of children experienced their married parents' separation by age 15. As a result, most children in the US will spend at least some time living apart from one of their parents. In addition, increases in divorce and non-marital births have contributed to complex family structures in which mothers or fathers have had children with multiple partners. As family formation has changed, so too has engagement with the labor market and the interrelationships among marriage, childbearing, and work. I could spend a whole time talking about those, but given limited time, I'll just note 2 points. First of all, married men's employment advantage has declined, but it hasn't gone away completely. This chart shows that married men are still more likely to work than married women. In 1970, white married men were more than 50 percentage points more likely to work than married women. That differential is less than 20 percentage points by the late 1990s. And over the same period, the differential between Black married men and married women fell from about 35 percentage points to 10. Now, the gap for single men and women, we can't consistently distinguish single parents, has all but disappeared. And for Black single men and women, it has actually reversed, especially if we include institutionalized individuals as unemployed, in which case Black unmarried women are about 10 percentage points more likely to be working than Black unmarried men. Over the same period, earnings differentials among workers declined for married men and women and essentially disappeared for unmarried men and women. So the bottom line is that overall, fathers' ability to support their children financially is no longer much greater than mothers, but neither do mothers have a substantial advantage. Now, child support policy evolved in this context. Given contemporary family patterns, the child support enforcement system is relevant to at least half of all children. But child support policy is important not just because so many are affected, but because it requires policymakers to address normative questions typically viewed as private family matters. We child support researchers and family policy researchers, in turn, must choose to accept or to challenge how these questions are addressed. I think in many cases, these choices are implicit, but I would argue that the unacknowledged acceptance of the prevailing framework often reinforces existing inequities, especially when that framework reflects conventional wisdom emerging from experiences shaped by race or class. In such cases, those whose perspectives are excluded may face policies that are inconsistent with the challenges they confront. Child support policy and research provides an example of the ways in which perspective, grounded in discipline and ideology or lived experience, shapes the questions and the answers that emerge. Briefly, child support enforcement system requires that each state develop guidelines that specify the amount of support that non-resident parent, most often the father, should provide to the resident parent, most often the mother, for the financial support of their children. For simplicity today, I will often use gendered language and refer to non-resident parents as fathers going forward. The amount of child support ordered typically depends on a formula that varies with the number of children and each parent's income. For example, 25% of income for 2 children. When the father has regular employment in the formal labor market, child support is generally automatically deducted from their paycheck and transferred to the child support enforcement system by the system to the mother. In fact, 75% of all child support collections are now from employer withholding. Guidelines are designed to improve horizontal equity and establish expectations that may reduce the scope of conflict between parents. How are the guideline amounts determined? Initially, guidelines typically reference continuity of expenditures. In other words, that non-resident parents should continue to provide the same amount provided when the family lived together. Broadly speaking, the system assumes that families begin as married couples or as an intact household consisting of the parents and their children in common. While the system is for the most part gender neutral, the program initially was consistent with a gendered division of labor, with children typically living with their mother, presumed to be the primary caretaker, and relying on their father, presumed to work and earn more than the mother, primarily for financial support. Interviews I conducted recently with key policy analysts and researchers who influenced the development of the current system confirmed that many were focused on a child support system designed to require middle-class, stably employed, absent fathers to share the wealth with their children. Outcomes would thereby be more equitable, since mothers typically worked and earned far less than fathers. As the system developed, if fathers had stable earnings in the formal labor market, then the guidelines provided a clear standard for the child support order, and with automatic withholding, child support would be consistently deducted from earnings. So fathers would meet their obligations as providers, mothers and children would avoid poverty, since the fathers typically had sufficient resources to provide. In this context, fathers who failed to pay were generally judged as unwilling rather than unable. But in contrast to this gender equity focused narrative, many aspects of the child support system developed to reflect a very different project, to require non-resident fathers to offset the cost of welfare payments made on behalf of their poor children. While some mothers received welfare following divorce from relatively well-off fathers, many fathers of low-income children receiving welfare were themselves low income. To quote my colleagues Mincy and Sorensen, many were dead broke rather than deadbeat dads. Rather than restoring or reinforcing the economic arrangements that had supported children when their parents were married or living together, child support aimed to enforce expectations regarding the contributions of low-income fathers in contexts where they were not always part of a stable union and which they often did not have the economic capacity to provide sufficient support. For fathers lacking regular earnings in the formal labor market, the child support order was often inconsistent with their ability to pay. In the absence of stable formal earnings, automatic withholding is less effective, and a father can accrue child support debt that is subject to a high interest rate. Moreover, if children received welfare, child support payments were largely retained by states to offset welfare costs. The child would not benefit directly. Thus, for many low-income mothers, this cost recovery meant that child support system interfered with their relationship with the fathers, but offered them little in return to reduce their poverty. Child support and related research has grappled more or less explicitly with the challenges of these very different projects, sharing the wealth within middle-class divorcing families with stably employed fathers and requiring poor fathers with unstable earnings to provide for poor children, often born to unmarried parents, with the goal of reimbursing the welfare costs of the state. The division between welfare cases and non-welfare cases has been an explicit area of concern. In some ways, the system has recognized the difference between marital and non-marital cases, but in other ways, it has tried to erase any difference, most fundamentally by insisting that biological fathers' child support obligations are identical, regardless of marital status or the social relationship within the family. Finally, while no child support policy explicitly distinguished the treatment of white and Black families, divisions in practice and policy according to welfare status and marital status often coincided with implicit divisions by race. As shown in this figure, white single mothers were more likely to be divorced and to have more education relative to Black single mothers. Thus, as child support policy developed, the divorcing middle-class father leaving his wife was most often white, while the motivation for cost recovery and the more punitive requirements associated with cases receiving cash assistance were consistent with racialized welfare policies. Child support policy developed as a solution to two distinct problems: equity between divorcing parents and concerns about public welfare costs. That these issues were unequally distributed across families by race and class, and more or less salient for policymakers and analysts, I think helps explain the development both of child support policy and related research. There's a substantial literature that addresses the role of race in shaping two related systems: the welfare system that accounted for much of the child support caseload in its early years, and the criminal justice system, which has become more relevant for child support enforcement and in shaping non-resident parents' ability to pay support. In policy analytic research, most studies of child support outcomes treated race as a control variable in regression analyses, and infrequently focused on the extent to which policies or their impacts differed systematically by race. As noted by a number of the people I interviewed, in part this reflects that mostly white, mostly middle-class researchers often drew on experiences that were more familiar to us: divorce by stably employed men who could afford to pay child support. Having said that, it would be unfair to characterize mainstream policy analysis as failing to address the constraints faced by low-income fathers and by families of color. In fact, many key research efforts over the last 30 years have had this focus, from the MDRC evaluation of Parents' Fair Share to the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study. But even though we now recognize heterogeneity in fathers and family situations, I would argue that our analysis and policymaking often continues to reflect limited perspectives. I want to give two examples of recent efforts to reform the child support system just as illustrations: a major evaluation and a major policy revision. Truth in Advertising, I was PI for the evaluation. That's where that picture with Matt comes in. And I was tangentially involved in the policy revision when I served in the Obama administration. So the first example. In 2012, the Federal Office of Child Support Enforcement launched the Child Support Non-Custodial Parent Employment Demonstration, or CSPED, which targeted non-custodial parents struggling to work and pay support, offering a combination of child support services, for example, right-sizing orders, employment services, and parenting services, with the goal of increasing the reliable payment of child support. The demonstration enrolled over 10,000 participants in 18 programs in 8 states. Most were fathers of color, a majority had children with multiple partners, self-reported criminal justice conviction, had unstable earnings, and most earned at least half or owed at least half their earnings in child support. So how did CSPED do? Well, did it work? A summary of selected outcomes is shown in this figure. They suggest very limited success for a model of child support enforcement in which fathers are required and enabled to pay sufficient support to significantly improve the economic status of their children. Earnings increased modestly by some measures. I'm showing you the one measure where it did increase by 4% in the first year in administrative data. There was no impact by survey measures or in the second year. Child support orders and payments declined modestly. On the other hand, both the implementation and the impact analyses suggest that CSPED was remarkably successful in supporting the transition, in some cases, the transformation of the child support enforcement system to one that better acknowledges the limited earnings capacity of many non-resident fathers. The reduction in child support orders can actually be seen as a positive outcome, as that many orders were previously set at levels inconsistent with fathers' ability to pay. And a less punitive approach yielded almost the same payments. At the same time, the increase in non-resident parent satisfaction with child support services was significant, as you can see in this slide, and substantial in all the sites, transforming the relationship between non-resident parents and the child support system that now was responding to the reality of their situations. This interpretation suggests greater potential to better serve low-income non-resident parents struggling to meet their child support obligations. At the same time, it does not provide evidence that earnings gains will be sufficient to generate higher payments. Now, that comes to the second example that I have. At the same time that CSPED was being implemented and evaluated, OCSE was undertaking a major revision of federal child support regulations, with what became the Flexibility, Efficiency, and Modernization in Child Support Enforcement Programs rule, which was finalized in 2016. In part, these regulations aim to make child support orders consistent with ability to pay. They call for orders to be based on actual earnings, not presumed earnings potential, and for orders to consider the non-resident parent's need to keep some earnings for self-support. While the regulation mandates that non-resident parents' basic subsistence needs be considered, it leaves consideration of the needs of resident parents and children at state's discretion. So these regulations recognize that not all non-resident parents can pay substantial support, but they implicitly assume that resident mothers can manage to both care for and provide more for their children when the father pays less. Now, what evidence suggests that mothers can manage without child support when the fathers of their children cannot afford to pay? Even though the gap in earnings that favors men has declined and even reversed for Black single adults, mothers hardly have a big advantage. And while resident mothers benefit from some elements of a social safety net not available to non-resident fathers, many public benefits require work, for example, the EITC, are not uniformly available, for example, housing assistance, or simply partially offset a direct cost of being the resident parent, for example, subsidized childcare. I would argue that available evidence suggests that many children whose fathers have limited ability to pay support live with mothers with similarly limited incomes. So rejecting the assumption that all fathers can pay enough child support in favor of an assumption that all mothers can manage without child support or other resources, I think contradicts the evidence. Two additional policies, however, would go a long way to making the child support system work better for families. First, a child allowance. The recent National Academy report on reducing child poverty proposes a universal child allowance that would benefit all children. It recommends a benefit of $3,000 per child per year, which would exceed the child support typically received by children of low-income resident parents. And it's estimated by the panel to reduce child poverty by about 40%. Second, child support assurance. That is a federal guaranteed child support payment even when the non-resident parent does not have the ability to pay or does not pay. This proposal has a long history, including proposals by Irv Garfinkel and David Elwood, and more recently by Dan Meyer and I. Child support assurance is more relevant now as the new regulations call for orders to account for father's ability to pay and to consider his need for self-support. Without child support assurance, this leaves many children living with low-income mothers less than they need. A child support guarantee would also address the challenges that emerge when a non-resident parent owes support to many children across multiple households. Orders could be set at reasonable levels for payers while still providing substantial support to all of their children. Now, a child allowance would be particularly consequential for low-income families, but it has been proposed as a universal program. A child support assurance program is targeted only to children who live apart from a parent and whose parent earns too little to pay sufficient support. In practice, children of color would be more likely to benefit from the targeted program, both because they are overrepresented among single-parent families and because parents of color are overrepresented among those with low earnings. However, neither of these policies explicitly address the history of discriminatory policies and practices that have contributed to these patterns in the first place. Other universal proposals, for example, baby bonds, would begin to address wealth gaps, and targeted policies such as reparations would explicitly address racial inequality and have the potential to more directly address some of the key inequalities that underlie the issues that are apparent in the child support system. I have argued quickly today that examining the development of child support policy provides a window into how the perspectives of policymakers and policy analysts shaped the definition of the problem to be solved, the understanding of the costs and benefits of policy alternatives, and that child support policy embodies assumptions about what non-resident parents owe to their children, reflecting judgments about what children need and deserve, about the distribution of responsibility to meet those needs between parents, and about the responsibilities of parents and the state. Analysis of family policy often sidelines these normative issues. That has certainly been the case from my own contributions. For example, regarding child support payments, the question is often reframed in terms of the child support order level that will generate the highest payments to the children or the lowest debt for the father, putting aside the normative question of what non-resident parents should pay to instead consider the empirical question of what they do pay, given different order amounts. While there's a literature in other fields, for example, law, relatively little traditional policy analytic research has addressed the question of whether fathers who were never married to the mother of their children and may not have an ongoing relationship should pay the same support as divorced non-resident fathers, though there is a substantial body of research showing that they often do not. More recently, as the challenges of developing child support policy for complex families, where one or both parents have children with other partners, have begun to receive more attention, there has been some discussion of what is reasonable to expect. But again, most of the analysis, including my own, has avoided deep engagement with normative questions and has instead focused on documenting the frequency of complex families and how child support compliance varies across different arrangements. But normative principles or assumptions underlie many of the policy choices, and failing to recognize those assumptions make them harder to challenge. Early child support policy referenced the resources provided by fathers in married couple families, in part because men were expected to do the right thing and marry the mother of their children. But dramatic declines in shotgun marriages, changes in gender roles, contraceptive options, and access to abortion all challenge the simple narrative of a pregnant single woman waiting for a father to solve the problem with a marriage proposal, and similarly challenge a punitive response to the man who fails to do so. If we argue instead that children have a right to support from both parents, a children's rights perspective, then presumably this applies to all children, not just those whose mothers apply for means-tested assistance and are therefore required to establish paternity and a child support order. Alternatively, if we require support only from those receiving assistance in order to repay taxpayers, we must be willing to argue that that financial priority is sufficient to justify the loss of privacy and autonomy disproportionately imposed on families of color that is inherent in current policy. Arguably, conventional policy analysts are not well placed to tackle these normative questions. Certainly my discipline, economics, has not typically focused on the role of power and values. And it might be better, it would certainly be easier, if we could cleanly divide our areas of interest and avoid these complications. But I hope that I have convinced you that implicit answers to these questions inform the policy options we consider, the questions we ask, the data we collect, and the questions we are thereby able to answer. If ignoring implicit issues that are nonetheless salient means we fail to take measures to guard against the resulting biases, then we exacerbate the challenges to the integrity of our analysis. While some worry that increasing attention to power and perspective, for example, critical race theory, threatens unbiased policy analysis. I would argue that ignoring perspectives implicit in our research is a bigger threat. We cannot evaluate the extent to which our research is robust to alternative assumptions until we acknowledge those assumptions. Even those inclined to reject the argument that research should be judged by its usefulness to marginalized groups may recognize as particularly problematic a misguided focus that reflects assumptions about communities systematically less likely to be represented in the conversation. Looking back at 25 years of my own engagement in social policy research, I am struck by how long it took me to appreciate how fundamentally assumptions implicit in existing policy and informing my own perspective shaped the questions I asked and the issues I ignored. I remain dedicated to the project of identifying important policy relevant questions and using the best available research designs and data to develop answers that can inform better policy. That is core to APPAM, and I believe it remains a very worthy project. But I am more aware of the need to address the limitations and biases inherent in my perspective, reflecting my disciplinary training, my positionality, my ideology, my personal and professional history. This requires thinking more deeply and systematically about implicit assumptions, making them explicit, and either providing a justification or developing a strategy to address the resulting limitations. It requires recognizing that the things and the people we count reflect judgments about what matters, judgments that should be defended or revised. I cannot imagine ignoring the choice of estimator or data source or issues of survey non-response in explaining empirical results. But I have been less systematic and less attentive in addressing potential biases that reflect my perspective. Of course, recognizing the role of perspective also highlights the value of diverse perspectives, the theme of last year's conference, for building stronger evidence to support policy change. Engaging with people and communities that bring different perspectives, whether because of differences in training, ideology, positionality, or personal or professional history, is fundamental to the project of fostering excellence in public policy and management research, analysis, and education, the mission of APPAM. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share these reflections. I look forward to your questions. As Matt said, to submit a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. Okay, we have about 10 minutes to walk through some questions. So I have my first question here is from Dave Chancellor. What about a basic guaranteed income for everyone in addition to the program suggested?
So with no budget constraint, that would definitely be a good idea. This is outside my expertise to judge how you weigh that, the pros and cons of a universal basic income versus a universal child allowance versus more targeted approaches. But I think that's definitely that should be part of the conversation. It's a good question.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is, how has federalism affected these problems in a child support policy? Is there enough or too much role for the states in this policy area? Would a stronger federal role lead to more than just outcomes?
So I think that's a really interesting question. I think I have done most of my work on child support actually from a state perspective, though I've spent some time at OCSE and thinking about federal pieces. I don't see that as the crux of the issue. I actually think there's a very strong national policy debate among practitioners, facilitated. Some of it is within kind of formal structures. A lot of it is through national professional associations like NCF, for those of you who are child support junkies. I think there's a lot of good information sharing that takes place. So I think the challenges are, I think a lot of the innovation can be driven or at least allowed from the federal level, but I don't believe that if we federalize, that would necessarily make things better.
Great, thank you. A next question is, thank you for making a strong case for the concept that unacknowledged assumptions and limited perspectives have been barriers to effective evidence-based policy in child support. Can you say more about the solution you offered, Diversity Will Strengthen Work? What are ways that we can bring diverse perspectives in child support policy research, perhaps community participatory research approaches?
Well, I think there's lots of things we can do across many different sectors. I mean, I think this conference, so I would offer congratulations to Sherry for the wonderful program that she put together for this year. I think this, if you look across APPAM over time, I think when I came as a graduate student at the urging of Sheldon Danziger in 1991, because he said that would be how I would meet people that would eventually give me a job when I finished my dissertation. We were mostly economists and political scientists, and it was very hard to find many sociologists or folks from other fields amongst us. And I think it was more dominated by quantitative folks. And I think there was less attention to the importance of implementation. So I think I believe I started as a very formal economist. And with each passing year, I've gotten more grounded. And the more grounded I get, the more appreciation I have for folks who can look at the world and really make sense out of the challenges of implementing policy and really making change on the ground. And so I think that's a piece of it. I think another piece, though, that we really have to pay attention to is who's around the table and who's not. And I think that requires really systematic attention, not because necessarily people are striving not to be inclusive, but because the easiest thing to do is to pick up the phone and call whoever you knew from graduate school or whoever you talk to at the conference you usually go to. And I think we live in a context that has been shaped and continues to be shaped by fundamentally unequal and racist and sexist, often, institutions. And we need to proactively work against that to make sure that there's a broader set of people around the table. And I think the thing that I would stress is that we don't need to do that because we want to be nice to the folks that have been excluded. We need to do that so that we can do better work, right? We need to do that so that everybody will be smarter, so that the work that we produce will be better and more useful. And I think that's what I'm trying to argue here, is that it shouldn't be controversial, because I think there's quite a bit of evidence in the world that when you bring together more diverse teams, and I mean that both in terms of quantitative and qualitative researchers, and I'm an economist, so I'll divide the world into economists and not, but I recognize that that division is problematic. But folks that have, one of the things that's really clear to me, and one of the things I want to express a lot of gratitude for all the folks that sat down with me for long interviews about how we got to where we are with child support research. And it was just great fun to talk with folks that were so fundamental to the founding of this field. And many, pretty much to a one, there's maybe one exception, folks told me a story about something that happened in their life, or to their sister, or to themselves, or to somebody they knew, that really influenced how they thought about the program and the problems that needed to be solved. And so if that's part of what's shaping our work, and some people's stories are in that collection of stories we're reflecting, and other people's stories aren't there, then we're going to not do the kind of work we want to do, and we're not going to have the impact that we want to have. So I think it's a question of really recognizing how critical it is. It's like I said, I would never not worry about response rates. When I use survey data, I would never not worry about whether the estimator I use is the appropriate one for this kind of analysis. But I haven't always stepped back and been as critical as I should have been about the questions I was asking, the way that I was framing those questions. So I'm learning, late in the game, but I'm learning.
Thanks, Maria. Okay, we have a couple more here. You present some forward-thinking policies. How important do you think it is to also address consequences of existing policies? For example, huge debt, suspended licenses, interest on arrears. How do you balance the imperative to undo past policy mistakes with the need to implement a new set of policies that are more cognizant of the normative side of things that you've discussed?
Well, I think one of the things I would take away from the CSPED evaluation, which is something that Dan and I and our colleagues at Mathematica and elsewhere, we spent 7 or 8 years of our life deeply engaged in this project. I think one thing that we learned is a lot of the sites implemented much less punitive approaches with much less license suspension and many fewer kind of the big sticks. So it is news that payments didn't go down really, like tiny bit. Orders went down, payments went down by even less. So we lost pretty much nothing. Now, we didn't get to tell a story that all of a sudden people's earnings got so much higher and they paid so much support, but we lost almost nothing. And you saw those gains in kind of support for the system, which we would hope in the long run might lead to better outcomes. So I don't think we necessarily have to, I think there's not a lot of evidence that a lot of that stick has been particularly effective at getting what we want. So I think there's a lot of room to move forward. And I do think the new regs they're not so new anymore, but they haven't been, can I say that in the last 4 years, they haven't maybe been pushed forward quite as effectively as they might have been. I think there's a lot of potential in the regulations to do less harm. I think we just then need to step back and recognize that we still need to figure out a way to support kids. And we can't just say, oh, we realize these are low-income dads, they can't pay much support, and then stop there. We need to understand then what are we going to do? Because otherwise we're asking low-income moms to both work and take care of their kids. And I'm using gendered language. It's not always the mom and the dad who are the resident and non-resident. I'm just using that for shorthand.
Thank you so much. At this point, we're going to go ahead and hand it over to Sherry Gleed. I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, so if you'd like them to still be acknowledged, please send someone at APPAM an email with that, and we can forward those on to Maria.
I would appreciate that.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Sherry Gleed, and I am the incoming president of APPAM. My goodness. Thank you, Maria, for a profound and provocative address. I was thinking as I was listening that I always learn from listening to you. I am really honored and delighted to present you with the APPAM Presidential Award. It's actually been one of the unexpected and really wonderful benefits of having become APPAM President-elect that I've had the chance to know and work with you. You are wise, irreverent, funny, thoughtful, and you are going to be a very hard act to follow. And you've also somehow managed to be an exceptionally effective APPAM president, even while serving as a new dean, which is in itself a very difficult task, and dealing with all the complications of this terrible pandemic. Maria, thank you for your dedication and your grace in navigating this organization through what has been an extraordinarily challenging year. From all of us at APPAM, I would like to present you with this presidential award. Are you ready to try this?
I'm ready. Here we go.
Ready? Here we go.
Thank you very much, Sherry. I think our adaptation of this award is a good sign of how well we've collaborated. It's been, I would just echo Sherry's words, working with Matt and Sherry is one of the great joys, second only to working with the extraordinary staff of APPAM. It has just been a wonderful opportunity. I'm looking forward to being past president, and mostly I'm looking forward now. Actually, I guess, Sherry, I think you get to welcome people to the things that follow this. So thanks, everybody.
Yes. Okay, congratulations again.
Thank you.
And this evening we're hosting special policy area receptions. As Maria said, the APPAM staff are truly unbelievable, and Tristan Stout is the conference guru. She's going to explain to all of you how you join these policy area receptions. Over to you, Tristan.
Perfect. Thank you, Sherry. For everyone, I just posted a link to our special events page in our program where you can find the links to each of our 15 policy area receptions happening this evening. You can join through any of those links and then just use the same password that you've been using all day to access those. We'll have leaders for each one, members of our program committee, general members of APPAM, leading them, and we will be using some of the questions that many of you submitted through our Google form last week. So we hope to see you all there. They all start at 5 p.m. so you do get a little bit of a break between this and then. We're looking out for you still. So go ahead, get a snack, grab a glass of wine, and we'll see you at the policy area receptions. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks, everybody. I like the pie plate, Sherry.
That worked really well. It looked
Did
awesome.
it look?
It
It
really,
was perfect.
it looked just, the Emmys got nothing on us.
And I will tell this story. This will be a story. The pie plate will be a story. Lambeau Field and the pie plate will both be a story. So thanks to both of you. I wish I could buy you a glass of wine, but I owe
Great
you one
speech.
post-pandemic.
That will happen.
Okay,
It will happen.
we'll make it
Okay,
happen.
bye-bye.
Okay,
Well
bye-bye.
done. Well done.